Welcome, traveler of forgotten centuries. Tonight we step into a world of fog and fever, of ships that whispered death before they ever docked. If you listen closely, you can almost hear it, the groan of old timbers drifting on a black tide, the flutter of torn sails that once carried the lifeblood of nations, but now they carry something else, something unseen, something that terrifies even the bravest sailor. The year is 1347. Europe hums with trade, power, and promise. From the bustling harbors of Venice to the crowded quays of London, ships are the arteries of an empire of commerce. They bring silk from the East, spices from Arabia, and gold from Africa. Each arrival is a celebration. Merchants rush to the docks, children climb onto barrels for a glimpse of the exotic, and the smell of salt and wealth fills the air. But this time, the air smells different. On an early autumn morning, the sun rises through a thin mist over the Sicilian port of Messina. The fishermen who have worked these waters for generations notice a shadow far out at sea. It's a merchant vessel, a Genoese galley. Its sails hang loose as though exhausted. The ship drifts rather than glides. No flags wave from its masts. No voices echo from its deck. At first, the townspeople cheer. Another trading ship, another cargo of silk, perhaps, or sugar. But as it nears, the cheering fades. There's something wrong. The air around the ship seems to carry a weight, a smell of rot and sickness, faint but unmistakable. And then, as the galley turns, the first body slides into view. A sailor slumped against the rail, unmoving, his skin blackened in patches. Another lies sprawled across the deck, the sea washing gently over his legs. A murmur runs through the crowd on shore. A mother shields her child's eyes. A priest clutches his cross. Someone whispers, "It's a plague ship." Within hours, the harbor master orders the vessel away. But it's too late. A small group of dock workers, desperate for coin or curious beyond reason, have already rowed out to investigate. By nightfall, they are feverish. Within days, the city's bells toll endlessly. Messina has become the first European port claimed by the Black Death.
Before the plague ships, Europe thought it understood death. It had seen wars, famines, and fires, but nothing prepared it for this. The harbors, once symbols of connection and prosperity, became doorways for invisible killers, and so began an age of silence. In Venice, the merchants who built fortunes on maritime trade began to fear the sea itself. The city that had conquered the Mediterranean now looked at every approaching ship as a possible omen of doom. Men whispered about vessels of pestilence, ships cursed by God, their crews dead but still drifting into port as if drawn by some malevolent will. At night, the lanterns on the docks flickered over empty waters. No one wanted to unload cargo anymore. Sailors were turned away, left to starve aboard their ships. Some cut their own anchor ropes and drifted aimlessly, praying the wind would carry them to safety, or at least somewhere to die unseen. By the winter of 1348, the silence had spread. Marseille, Genoa, Pisa, Ragusa. Every port had its own story of the silent harbor, that one moment when the usual cries of merchants, the splash of ropes, and the clang of bells fell into eerie stillness as a ship appeared on the horizon. Sometimes the ships were found with their crews already dead, their bodies bloated and black. Other times they carried the living, feverish, delirious sailors begging to be led ashore, unaware they were already condemned. But the most terrifying of all were the empty ships. They would appear out of the fog, drifting slowly toward the docks, their sails shredded by storms, the ropes tangled like veins. The gangplank would creak under the weight of the wind, and nothing more. No footsteps, no voices, no life. The locals called them the silent messengers. To touch such a ship was to invite death. To ignore it was to let it haunt your dreams. And yet, as the plague spread, more of these ghostly vessels appeared, each a floating tomb, each a reminder that the sea no longer carried trade and fortune, but fear itself.
Across Europe, harbors changed. What had been lively, chaotic centers of commerce became places of suspicion. Customs officers and priests stood side by side, inspecting ships through long poles and veils soaked in vinegar. If a ship was found to be tainted, its crew was forbidden to disembark. Some ports demanded that incoming ships anchor offshore for 40 days, 40 giorni, giving birth to a new word, quarantine. It was a desperate compromise between survival and mercy. But the truth was darker. Many captains, once denied entry, would die at sea, their ships drifting aimlessly until they struck another coast. There, the same story would repeat: curiosity, contact, and contagion. Letters from the time speak of harbors lined with burning ships, set aflame by city orders to stop the infection from spreading. One Venetian chronicler wrote, "The sea burned that night like a candle to God, but he did not answer." In these silent harbors, a new kind of fear was born. It wasn't the terror of battle or the dread of famine. It was the fear of the unseen. The enemy had no face, no weapon, no banner. It traveled in the breath, the touch, the very air. People turned on one another. Dock workers fled inland. Fishermen refused to fish. Families barricaded themselves in their homes, praying the tide would turn. But it never did. And still the ships came. From Alexandria, from Constantinople, from the far corners of the known world they arrived, some by wind, others by drift, always with the same cargo, death and the echo of human desperation. Yet within this darkness, strange stories emerged. In Marseille, they said a single ship survived because its captain sealed himself in his cabin with bread, wine, and a prayer, refusing to see another soul. In Venice, an old nun claimed she saw angels walking on the waves, carrying the souls of dead sailors toward the horizon. And in London, rumors spread of a black galley that appeared on nights when the fog rolled in thick, a vessel with no crew, whose lantern burned with blue fire, gliding silently upriver. These stories became folklore, part truth, part terror. But they served a purpose. They gave the unknowable a face, a shape, a voice. They reminded people that death could come quietly, with the sound of waves and gulls, with the smell of tar and salt, and that sometimes the most frightening thing in the world is a ship that says nothing at all.
As the plague moved inland, the harbors emptied, the bells stopped, the gulls scattered, and for the first time in centuries, the great ports of Europe, the veins of its prosperity, lay still. The silence that fell over the docks of Messina, Venice, and London was not mere absence of sound. It was a kind of mourning. Every plank of wood, every rope, every echo of the sea carried a memory of those who had once lived by the ocean and were now claimed by it. The harbors had become graveyards, and the ships their tombstones. And so began the legend of the plague ships, vessels that carried not cargo, but curses, that arrived without crew, yet with purpose, that drifted into history like whispers on the wind. For centuries to come, sailors would still glance nervously toward the horizon when the fog grew thick, wondering if the next shadowed sail belonged to one of them. The sea had always been mysterious, but now it was something worse. It was haunted. The year is 1377. The Adriatic Sea glows under a dying sun, and the city of Ragusa, modern-day Dubrovnik, stands guard over its narrow harbor like a fortress of marble and fear. The air smells of salt, incense, and burning herbs. On the horizon, a fleet of ships drifts at anchor, their sails slack, their crews restless. None dare come closer. For months, the city's council has watched death spread across the sea. Word has reached them from Genoa and Messina, from the ports of Venice and Marseille. Ships arriving full of bodies, blackened by a mysterious sickness. The plague has no mercy and no pattern. It kills the rich and the poor alike. It enters through trade, through touch, through the very breath of strangers. So, the men of Ragusa make a decision that will change history. They decree that all arriving ships must wait 30 days before entering the city. Trentino, they call it, a time of observation, a space between life and death. If, after those 30 days, no one aboard shows signs of sickness, they may come ashore. It sounds simple now, but in the 14th century, such a command feels like defying God himself. To shut the gates of a port, to deny passage, trade, and communion, is to challenge the very order of civilization. Yet the people obey, because fear has its own faith, and in those days, the church bells toll for the living as much as the dead.
At first, sailors laugh at the decree. They call it foolishness, a superstition born of panic. But as the weeks pass, laughter turns to silence. One by one, the men aboard the anchored ships begin to cough, to burn with fever, to die. From the walls of Ragusa, the townspeople watch the masts stand like crosses against the sky. The sea becomes a graveyard again. Soon, other cities follow. Venice, the queen of the Mediterranean, surrounded by water and trade, cannot afford another disaster. So the Venetian Senate expands Ragusa's rule. 40 days of waiting, 40 giorni. From this, a new word enters the language of fear, quarantine. Venice builds its first quarantine station on a lonely island in its lagoon. They call it the Lazaretto Vecchio, the Old Lazarus Island, named for the saint of resurrection. But there is no resurrection here, only waiting and the echo of prayers. The island becomes a world unto itself, part hospital, part prison, part purgatory. When a ship arrives with a sick crew, small boats row out to meet it. Masked men, doctors, guards, priests, order the sailors to disembark. Those who can walk are led ashore. Those who cannot are carried on stretchers. The ship itself is fumigated with burning herbs and vinegar. Its cargo is unpacked and left to bake under the sun. The living wait in cells of stone.
The dying are given a separate hall, a great room of silence broken only by coughs and whispered prayers. At night, the water laps softly against the walls, as if the sea itself is keeping vigil. One account from the time describes the lazaretto as a place between the sea and the grave. Another calls it the island that listens. And in a way, that is what quarantine becomes, an act of listening to the invisible. The world begins to realize that sickness has patterns, that contagion travels like rumor, carried by unseen hands. But knowledge is slow, and fear is faster. In Venice, rumors spread that the lazaretto is cursed, that once you enter, you never leave. Sailors whisper that the island glows at night, lit by the souls of the dead. Others claim they hear singing from across the water, hymns that no living mouth should know. Still, ships keep coming. And for every new arrival, the same ritual unfolds: isolation, fumigation, waiting. 40 days, 40 nights. Farther north, in Genoa, a merchant named Niccolo Contarini keeps a diary. In it, he writes, "I have seen the ships anchored beyond the city, their flags white as shrouds. The sailors stare at us from the decks as though we were ghosts. I too am afraid to look too long, lest the sickness find me through my eyes." Contarini's words capture the strange psychology of those years, a world divided by the sea, by invisible walls of fear. The quarantine lines become the new borders of civilization. Inside them, life goes on. Markets open, churches ring their bells, lovers meet in secret. Beyond them, the sea waits, holding its dead.
The idea spreads across Europe like a different kind of contagion, one of caution. Marseille establishes its own quarantine island. Dubrovnik builds guard towers. London assigns plague wards near the docks. Even small fishing villages begin to post sentinels along the cliffs, watching for sails that might carry death. And everywhere, the same debate rages. Is quarantine salvation or cruelty? To the merchant, it is ruin. To the priest, it is mercy. To the sailor, it is a sentence. Imagine the life aboard one of those waiting ships. The days stretch endlessly. The crew counts time by the tides, by the setting of the sun, by the slow decay of hope. Food runs low. Rats multiply. The smell of sickness grows thicker. At night, men lie awake listening to the waves slap against the hull, a sound that begins to feel like breathing. Some ships drift closer to shore, desperate for contact. They light lanterns to signal health. Others, ashamed or terrified, sail back into open water, never to be seen again. The sea swallows them without ceremony. A few survivors tell strange tales of ghostly lights dancing over the quarantine islands, of voices whispering their names in the dark, of sailors who walked into the sea convinced they could reach the shore by faith alone. Whether true or not, these stories shape Europe's soul. Quarantine becomes not only a measure of safety, but a symbol, the physical expression of mankind's struggle against the unseen. In Venice, a physician named Jacopo di Dondi begins to study the quarantined patients. He records their symptoms, the patterns of their fevers, the marks on their skin. He notices that the sickness does not always strike at once, that it hides, waits, and then blooms like rot beneath the flesh. From his observations grows a new understanding of incubation, the time between exposure and death. His notes are crude, written in the language of theology and fear, but they contain the seeds of modern medicine.
For the first time, people begin to believe that disease has logic, that perhaps it can be understood, even controlled. And so, from the terror of the plague ships, something remarkable is born. The first scientific battle against the invisible world. Still, the human cost is staggering. Thousands die not from the sickness, but from solitude. Men locked away on the islands lose their minds. Some refuse food. Others sing to the waves until their voices give out. Gravediggers work without pause, their faces hidden behind cloth soaked in vinegar. At night, they bury the dead by torchlight, the sea reflecting the fire like molten glass. There are stories of love, too, amid the horror. A Venetian nurse named Beatrice, assigned to the Lazaretto Vecchio, writes letters to her husband on the mainland. Each one she seals in wax and leaves for the priests to deliver. She writes, "I fear the sea will forget us before God remembers us." None of her letters ever reach him.
By the end of that decade, the islands of quarantine are crowded with bones, yet Europe survives. Slowly the tides of death recede, life returns to the harbors, ships unload their cargoes again. The bells ring not for funerals, but for trade. And the word quarantine becomes part of every tongue, a strange mixture of hope and horror. It means waiting, safety, punishment, and prayer, all at once. Centuries later, the same idea will save millions of lives. It will shape the way we face epidemics, pandemics, and even the unseen threats of the modern world. But in the 14th century, it was something far simpler, the last desperate defense of a civilization teetering on the edge of extinction. When you walk the streets of Venice today, you can still see the old quarantine islands, crumbling, silent, half swallowed by the sea. Tourists visit them without knowing their true story, but if you listen carefully, when the wind shifts, you might hear the echoes, the cough of a sailor, the toll of a distant bell, the whisper of a prayer rising through salt air. That is the sound of the birth of quarantine, the sound of fear becoming wisdom. The dawn of October 1347 began like any other along the Sicilian coast. The fishermen of Messina hauled their nets in silence. Gulls circled lazily over the waves, and merchants paced the docks, waiting for the latest ships from the east. The horizon was calm, pale gold against a still, endless sea. And then someone shouted, "Sails!" A cluster of dark shapes had appeared far out in the mist. 5 galleys, bearing the flag of Genoa, approaching slowly, their oars dipping weakly into the water. These were trading ships returning from the ports of the Black Sea, carrying silk, spices, and stories of distant wars. But something about them was wrong. Their sails hung like rags, their movement was sluggish, as if the sea itself resisted their arrival. The harbor master squinted into the sun, uneasy. "They're too quiet," he murmured. No shouts, no laughter, no songs from the crew, just the creak of wood and the whisper of wind. When the first ship entered the harbor, the smell came with it, a sour, sweet rot that turned stomachs and drew flies. Dock workers hesitated. Then one brave soul, a man named Giacomo, tied his rope and clambered aboard.
What he found silenced him forever. Bodies. Dozens of them. Men sprawled across the deck, their faces blackened, their eyes open but unseeing. Some still clutched the ropes as though they had tried to keep working until death claimed them. Others lay in heaps near the hold, flies thick as fog around them. And then, movement. A sailor, gaunt and trembling, staggered from below decks. His skin was mottled with dark swellings the size of eggs. His lips moved, but no sound came out. He reached a hand toward Giacomo and collapsed. By sunset, the docks of Messina were deserted. The sailors who had helped moor the Genoese ships fled into the city. The bishop ordered the port sealed, but fear had already taken root. Within 3 days, the sickness spread like fire through dry grass. No one knew what it was.
The priests called it God's punishment. The doctors called it bad air. The poor called it the devil's touch. But everyone agreed on one thing. It came from the sea. Witnesses described the first victims as feverish, shaking, their skin erupting with black sores, the buboes that would give the plague its name. The pain was unbearable. Within days, victims bled from their mouths, their breath turning sweet and foul at once. Then they died, some in agony, others in silence. The city of Messina fell into chaos. Families barricaded themselves inside their homes. Priests carried incense through the streets, muttering Latin prayers that vanished beneath the sound of wailing. Dogs howled endlessly. Bells rang endlessly. One chronicler wrote, "The air grew thick with sorrow. The sea, once our guardian, became our judge." And yet, despite the horror, the ships remained at anchor. 5 floating coffins bobbing gently in the harbor, their dead staring up at the sky. In desperation, the city's leaders tried to force the ships away. They sent soldiers to burn them, but the soldiers refused. None would touch the cursed vessels. Eventually, under cover of night, the surviving Genoese sailors, what few remained, cut their anchors and fled. They sailed north, desperate for refuge. Some went to Marseille, others to Genoa, and a few to Pisa. Everywhere they landed, the same story followed.
By winter, the plague had reached the Italian mainland. By spring, it was in France. By summer, England. Within 2 years, it had claimed over 1/3 of Europe's population. It all began here, with those 5 ships from the Black Sea drifting into Messina like messengers of death. But the true story of those ships begins even earlier, far to the east, in the port of Kaffa on the Crimean Peninsula. There, in 1346, a siege was underway. The Mongol army of the Golden Horde surrounded the city, where Genoese traders had built a fortress. The battle dragged on for months, and then something strange began to happen in the Mongol camp. Soldiers fell sick, one after another, their bodies covered in boils. The disease swept through their ranks like wildfire. In a grotesque act of vengeance, the Mongols used catapults to hurl their dead over the walls of Kaffa. The corpses landed with sickening thuds, bursting open in the streets. The defenders, horrified, dumped them into the sea, but the damage was done. The sickness had entered the city. When the surviving Genoese merchants fled Kaffa, they carried more than just goods. They carried the plague. It hid in the rats aboard their ships, in the fleas that infested the grain, in the lungs of men who thought themselves merely tired. They sailed west, unaware that they were bringing Europe its greatest nightmare. By the time they reached Messina, death was already their passenger. In the months that followed, Sicilian ports turned into places of terror. No one trusted the sea anymore. Ships were refused docking rights. Fishermen abandoned their nets. Merchants wept as fortunes rotted in warehouses. The harbor, once the beating heart of the city, became its grave. The bishop ordered mass processions to appease heaven. The people walked barefoot through the streets, carrying candles and crosses, chanting, "Miserere nobis, have mercy on us." But the plague marched faster than their prayers. Whole families vanished in a week. The graveyards overflowed. Bodies were buried in trenches and covered with lime. The air grew thick with smoke from burning clothes, furniture, and houses. A Venetian envoy who visited later wrote,
I saw the harbor of Messina, and it was silent as the tomb. The sea had taken the voice of the city.
As word spread across the Mediterranean, terror spread faster than the disease itself. In every port, people asked the same question: could it come here? And always, the answer was yes. Soon, the pattern became unmistakable. A ship arrived, people died, another ship fled, death followed. By the time rulers began to understand, it was too late. The great trading networks that had built Europe's wealth became the very veins through which death flowed. Even as the plague consumed entire cities, the sea was never still. Ships continued to sail, carrying not only goods, but also fear. Some captains lied about their cargo and their health, desperate for sanctuary. Others scuttled their vessels rather than risk spreading the disease. One legend tells of a ship called La Fortuna that set sail from Messina during the outbreak. The captain ordered that any sailor who showed signs of sickness be cast into the sea. By the time the ship reached the coast of France, none remained alive. La Fortuna drifted ashore with its cargo untouched, its bell tolling in the wind. No one dared approach it. The ship burned for 3 days. Even then, the flames were said to smell of rot. The people of Messina would never forget. For generations, the city carried the memory of that autumn morning, the black sails, the still waters, the silence before the horror. Parents warned their children, never trust a quiet ship. Even centuries later, sailors claimed that on foggy nights you could see ghostly masts in the harbor, the shadows of the plague ships returning again and again, seeking the home they never found. And perhaps, in some way, they did return, not in wood and sail, but in memory, in the echoes of fear that shaped how Europe saw the sea forever. From that moment onward, the ocean was no longer just a road to fortune. It was a threshold. Every harbor became a question, every ship a gamble between life and death. The tragedy of Messina was the spark that lit the dark age of the plague. It forced nations to build walls around the sea itself, but it also gave birth to something new, a fragile understanding that disease could travel, that humanity's greatest strength, its connectedness, could also be its downfall. And so, as the bells of Messina fell silent and the ships of Genoa drifted north carrying their invisible cargo, Europe crossed an invisible line from ignorance into dread, from innocence into knowledge. The plague ships had arrived, and the world would never be the same again. The Mediterranean had always been the sea of life, the cradle of empires, the mirror of gods. Its waters carried the songs of sailors, the hum of trade, the prayers of pilgrims. But in the years after 1347, it became something else entirely. A graveyard, a drifting expanse of ghosts. The plague had no master and no mercy. It moved with the wind, the tide, and the greed of men who could not stop their ships even when death stood beside them at the helm. Soon, the harbors of Europe were not just silent, they were haunted. By 1348, sailors told stories of ships seen adrift far out at sea, vessels without crew, their sails slack, their hulls listing like dying beasts. Sometimes they drifted for days before crashing against some lonely shore. Other times they vanished into fog, never to be seen again. The people gave them names whispered only in fear: the Black Sailors, the Carrion Fleet, the Silent Armada. But among them, one story rose above all: the legend of the Saint Lucia,
the first of the floating tombs. The St. Lucia had left Constantinople in the spring of 1348, bound for Venice with a cargo of silk, spices, and hope. Her captain, Matteo Rizzo, was known as a pious man, trusted by merchants and nobles alike. But 2 weeks into the journey, men began to cough. Then came the swellings, the fevers, the bleeding. Matteo ordered prayers. He burned incense in the hold, but by the 5th day, half his crew was dead. They threw the bodies overboard at first. The sea was wide, they thought, and merciful. But soon the dying outnumbered the living. The corpses were too many, the air too heavy. Rats scurried across the deck, their eyes bright and cruel. The last entries in the ship's log are barely legible, written in a trembling hand. Day 19, Marco is dead. We hear voices at night. The sea whispers, like breath through the dead. Day 21, I have sealed the hold. No one left but me and the rats. Day 22, God forgive me. I cannot go below. And then, nothing. Months later, fishermen off the coast of Crete spotted the St. Lucia drifting with torn sails and blackened timbers. They rowed close enough to see the crucifix nailed to her mast and the shape of a man tied to the wheel, head bowed, eyes hollow. No one boarded her. They say she burned for 3 nights after lightning struck her deck, a pyre on the open sea. To this day, Cretan fishermen refuse to sail on her anniversary, fearing her ghost will rise from the waves.
But the St. Lucia was only one among hundreds. The plague had turned Europe's proud merchant fleets into a macabre procession of drifting tombs. Ships left ports healthy and arrived rotting. Some reached shore with a handful of half-mad survivors. Others arrived completely silent. There were reports from Sicily, from Corsica, from the Balearic Islands, ships appearing on the horizon like phantoms, carrying the smell of death before the wind even changed. In Marseille, people spoke of a black fog that rolled in from the sea before the first cases appeared. In Venice, priests warned that the devil had taken command of the waves. In Naples, fishermen claimed to see lights flickering on the horizon, as if a fleet of ghost ships sailed forever between the living and the damned. The Mediterranean, once the heart of the world, had become a sea of warnings. The church struggled to make sense of it. Bishops declared that the floating ships were signs of divine wrath, penance for human arrogance. They ordered processions along the beaches, waving incense and chanting exorcisms toward the sea. In Venice, the Doge decreed that any ship found drifting should be burned immediately, no questions asked. But the sea does not obey kings or popes. The ships kept coming. One spring morning, the islanders of Malta awoke to find a massive carrack grounded in the shallows. Her name was Santa Maria della Pietà. She had sailed from Alexandria with 50 men aboard. When the Maltese boarded her, they found 48 corpses and 2 sailors still alive, locked in a cabin, delirious with fever. The men begged for water, then died before the sun set. The Maltese burned the ship to the waterline. Yet within weeks, plague swept across the island. They learned the cruel lesson that every port would soon understand. Sometimes even the smoke carries death. There are letters that survive from those years, desperate voices across time. One comes from a Florentine merchant named Lorenzo Dotti, writing to his wife in 1348. The harbor is filled with ships that no man dares to claim. The wind brings the stench of them into the city.
I dream of the sea at night, whispering my name, asking me to come and see what waits below the waves. Another from a monk in Marseille. I saw a ship drift into the bay at dawn. Its sails were torn, its masts bare. On the deck were birds feeding on what once were men. No one went near. We let the tide take it back. Such letters were rarely answered. Their senders often vanished within weeks.
In some places, people began to believe that the ships themselves had souls, cursed souls, restless and vengeful. They spoke of a fleet of dead sailors who still rode beneath the moonlight, ferrying the condemned to their fate. Sailors refused to sail after dark. Fishermen avoided waters where wrecks were said to drift. The once busy sea lanes fell silent. But for every tale of terror, there were also acts of impossible courage. In Venice, a young doctor named Giovanni di Padua volunteered to inspect plague ships anchored beyond the lagoon. Each morning, he rowed alone, wearing a waxed cloak and a mask stuffed with herbs. He climbed aboard the silent vessels, recorded what he saw, and burned the corpses himself. His notes survive in the archives of San Marco. Quote, "The silence aboard is deeper than prayer. The dead are arranged as though still working, at the ropes, at the tiller, at the altar. The rats are kings here." End quote. No one knows how long Giovanni survived. His records end abruptly with a single line, quote, "The sea has found me." End quote. By 1350, the Mediterranean had become a vast, open mausoleum. Travelers wrote of seeing debris floating for miles, crates, crucifixes, sandals, even rosaries drifting among the waves. The sea itself seemed to mourn, its waters thick with memory. Yet life, stubborn as always, refused to vanish entirely. Some ships survived, not by luck, but by discipline. Captains began enforcing new rules, fumigating cargo with vinegar, isolating the sick, praying at sunrise and sunset. These early precautions, born of terror, would one day evolve into maritime health codes and inspection laws. But at the time, it felt less like science and more like sorcery. In Ragusa, priests sprinkled salt around the docks. In Venice, plague ships were marked with red flags painted with black crosses, a warning to all who saw them. Even children learned what those colors meant: red for danger, black for death. The legend of the floating tombs grew with every passing year. In 1351, a Catalan chronicle described a ship of bones that washed ashore near Valencia, its hull filled not with cargo, but with skeletons arranged in rows. In 1362, pilgrims returning from the Holy Land spoke of a black galley drifting near Cyprus, its deck lit with blue fire. They swore they heard music coming from it, soft, mournful, like the sound of wind through a cathedral. Whether these stories were true or born from grief, no one could say. But they became part of Europe's collective memory, proof that the sea could hold grudges, that it remembered every name whispered into its depths.
Decades passed. The plague ebbed, then returned again and again. Each time it came, the ships followed, harbingers of a curse the world could not forget. Even when peace returned to the ports, no sailor ever looked at a quiet horizon the same way again. For centuries afterward, travelers told tales of ghost ships glimpsed to twilight. The St. Lucia, the Santa Maria, the nameless carracks of death. They said that if you listened closely, you could still hear their bells tolling beneath the waves, calling out to the living, "Remember us." And perhaps, in some way, the sea still does. Because the Mediterranean, calm, blue, eternal, hides beneath its beauty the bones of thousands who never reached shore.
The water glitters like glass in the sunlight. But when night falls and the wind rises, it whispers of the ships that carried not wealth, but ruin. The floating tombs of the plague. The ships that taught Europe to fear its own reflection. The fog over the Thames was always thick in the mornings, but in the spring of 1349 it seemed to carry something heavier. A stillness, a scent that clung to the air. Londoners had seen fog before, had lived with the stink of the river, the rot of fish and tar, the endless smoke of the city. But this was different. This was the breath of the plague. It came quietly, like a rumor. At first, the talk was of ships, foreign galleys from Calais and Flanders drifting into the estuary without signal or crew. The dockworkers who went to meet them found the same thing seen in Messina and Marseille: silence and the stench of death. By the time the first bells began to toll, the city understood what had arrived. London was a city of trade, proud, loud, alive. The Thames was its lifeblood, carrying grain, wool, spices, and dreams. Each morning, the docks roared to life. Sailors shouting, ropes creaking, merchants counting coins with hands stained by ink and salt. But now the quays stood empty. The river was full, but the people were gone. The plague had found its way upriver.
It began with a single ship moored at Deptford. A small merchant vessel, the Providence, arrived in early March from Gascony. Her captain reported that half his men had fallen ill during the voyage. The customs officers hesitated, but, under pressure from merchants desperate for wine and grain, allowed her to unload. Within a week, the dockhands who handled her cargo were dead. Rumors spread faster than the sickness. People said that the Providence had sailed through a fog that whispered, that rats poured off her decks like spilled ink. By the end of the month, no one dared approach a ship flying foreign colors. The Lord Mayor ordered all vessels anchored downstream to remain at distance until examined. But who would examine them? Even the plague doctors refused to step aboard. The ships waited, swaying gently on the tide, dozens of them, then hundreds, their masts black against the gray sky. From the river banks, Londoners stared across the water, hearing only the lap of waves and the cry of gulls. They began calling them the Ghost Fleet. The city had seen death before: famine, war, fire, but nothing like this. Bodies piled faster than they could be buried. The churchyards overflowed. Whole streets were boarded shut. Horses dragged wagons full of corpses through the alleys, wheels squealing over cobblestones slick with rain and grief. And always the river watched. The Thames became both a witness and a weapon. It carried death from one side of the city to the other. Ferries, barges, and rafts carrying the sick to the far shore, to hospitals that were already overflowing. The water glimmered with the reflections of lanterns and stars, and the occasional body that slipped beneath without a sound. A chronicler named Henry Knighton wrote, "The river turned black, not from filth, but from sorrow." Even the current seemed to mourn. By April, the harbor was a necropolis. The Ghost Fleet grew. Ships from the Low Countries, from Normandy, even from Scotland, all trapped by orders of quarantine. Some had been there so long their hulls were coated in moss, their ropes green and brittle. Sailors died aboard, their cries echoing across the fog. Some jumped into the water, hoping the current might carry them home. Others tied stones to their waists and disappeared willingly into the Thames's dark heart. The authorities, terrified that the infection would spread through the air, ordered the ships burned. And so, one by one, the fires began. It started at the docks near Woolwich, flames leaping from the decks of an abandoned galley, painting the night sky orange. The heat drove back the fog for a few fleeting moments, revealing the shapes of other ships, hulking silhouettes, each one a coffin, waiting for its turn. By dawn, the river glowed with a line of pyres. Witnesses said the smoke smelled not just of tar and pitch, but of flesh and spice, the strange sweetness of death. From across the river, families knelt in prayer, watching their livelihoods and loved ones burn. The fire ate everything: cargo, coin, memory. And when it was over, the ashes floated downstream toward the sea like gray petals on dark water. But the flames could not stop the sickness. London fell silent. Bells tolled until the ropes frayed. Priests collapsed mid-prayer. Bakers left loaves half-kneaded on their tables. Cats wandered the streets, mewing for owners who would never return. A letter survives from a dockside priest named Brother Edwin, written to his abbot in Canterbury before he too vanished. The river has become our churchyard. I hear the ships speak at night, creaks and whispers, as if their souls are restless. They are the last confessions of the drowned. It was said that on certain nights, when the fog rolled low over the water, the bells of burned ships could be heard tolling under the surface, the toll of those who never made it to shore. And yet, amidst the despair, the river continued to move. That was the cruelest part. Life, in its indifferent rhythm, refused to stop. The tide still came and went, the gulls still cried, and the merchants, ever practical, began to speak of rebuilding. By late summer, when the first signs of recovery appeared, the survivors of the docks emerged like ghosts themselves. They were thinner, older, their eyes hollow from what they had seen. They cleaned what remained of the piers, scrubbed the walls with vinegar, and began again. But no one ever spoke openly of the ships that burned that spring. To name them was to invite them back. The few who did speak told strange tales of figures seen walking along the water at night, their clothes dripping though no rain had fallen, of lights moving among the reeds like lanterns carried by invisible hands, of whispers that came from the mist saying names that no one living should know. They said that sometimes, when the tide was low and the wind still, you could see blackened hulls beneath the surface, the remains of the ghost fleet resting in the mud, their timbers creaking softly as the current shifted. Some claimed the river itself had grown vengeful, that it remembered the flames.
As years passed, the story of London's ghost fleet became half legend, half history. Children born after the plague would ask their elders, "Is it true the sea burned?" And the old ones would nod silently, staring out toward the gray horizon. Even centuries later, sailors refused to whistle while passing Woolwich, believing it called the dead from the depths. The Thames, they said, had ears. And perhaps it did. The river that once brought prosperity had also carried ruin. Its tides knew every secret, every fear. Each ripple was a memory, each current a whisper of what had been lost. In time, London rose again, rebuilt, repopulated, reborn. The docks thrived once more. Ships came and went, and new generations of sailors filled the taverns with laughter. But underneath the laughter was always the hum of remembrance. The ghost fleet had become a warning, a myth that outlasted the plague itself. And when the Great Fire of 1666 swept through the city, old men swore they saw shapes moving in the flames, masts and sails burning again, the river repeating its oldest story. Even today, the Thames holds its silence. Beneath the bridges, in the places where the water runs slow, divers sometimes find fragments, charred timbers, bits of chain, a rusted bell that never rings, each one a relic of the ghost fleet, each one a whisper from the spring when London learned that even the mightiest city can be brought to its knees by a ship that should never have come home. If you listen closely on a foggy night, when the bells of St. Paul's fade and the river seems to breathe, you might still hear them, the creak of unseen masts, the echo of oars dipping in the dark, the low moan of timbers that remember fire. London sleeps above them, but the river remembers. The ghost fleet is still there, moving with the tide. The bells of Venice had always rung for trade, to mark arrivals, departures, and the endless rhythm of commerce that made the city rich. But in the mid-14th century, those bells took on a different tone. They rang for the sick. From the belfries of San Marco, their echoes rolled over the lagoon like a lament. The canals were quiet, the markets shuttered. Gondolas carried not lovers or nobles now, but doctors in black masks, priests in crimson robes, and the condemned shivering beneath blankets that smelled of vinegar and despair. The plague had come to the city of mirrors. Venice had survived wars, floods, and sieges, but the plague was something new, invisible, untouchable, yet everywhere. It crept through the alleys like mist. It hid in the folds of silk and the breath of strangers. And so, in desperation, the city built its own exile, an island of silence. They called it Lazaretto Vecchio, the old Lazarus Island, after the saint who rose from the dead. The name was a prayer, a plea, that the dead might rise again, or at least that the living might not join them. The island lay just beyond the city walls, a half-hour by boat through still green water. From afar, it looked like a monastery. Up close, it was a fortress of fear. Every ship that entered the Venetian lagoon was stopped first at the Lazaretto. There, masked officials in waxed robes met the captains with long poles. They asked questions, shouted orders, and recorded every name. Those who were sick were sent ashore. Those who were not, or not yet, waited aboard their ships for 40 days. The rule was absolute. 40 giorni, 40 days of isolation. From it came the word that would outlive the plague: quarantine. At dawn, the boats arrived, families huddled together, clutching what little they could carry. The sick were separated from the healthy, wives torn from husbands, children from parents. The screams carried across the water. A priest at the dock blessed each soul as they stepped onto the island. May God receive you, and may Venice forgive you. For many, it was the last blessing they would ever hear. Inside the walls, there were no comforts, only stone, straw, and the endless stench of sickness. The rooms were small and bare, with narrow windows that let in the light, but not the air. Doctors and nurses moved like shadows, their faces hidden behind bird-like masks stuffed with herbs, lavender, mint, and rosemary. They believed the sweet scents could drive away the miasma, the bad air of death. They were wrong, but they kept believing, because belief was the only thing that didn't die. At night, the island came alive with whispers and coughs. From the mainland, Venetians could see faint lights flickering, candles of the dying, prayers of the condemned. They called them le luci dei morti, the lights of the dead. Even the water seemed to carry sorrow. The fishermen refused to cast their nets near the island, claiming that the fish there tasted of iron and ash. The gondoliers avoided the route entirely, steering clear of the dark waters that surrounded Lazaretto Vecchio. They said that sometimes at dusk, a lone figure could be seen walking along the pier, a doctor, or perhaps a spirit, pacing endlessly, waiting for dawn. Inside, the doctors kept their journals. One of them, a surgeon named Girolamo de Rossi, wrote, "I have seen the eyes of men who no longer fear death. The island is a purgatory between sea and sky. We are all sinners here, some dying for their sins, others for their mercy." His words captured the strange morality of the Lazarettos. There were no criminals here, yet everyone was imprisoned. No executioners, yet death worked tirelessly.
The days bled into one another. The smell of vinegar and smoke clung to everything, to walls, to skin, to breath. Corpses were collected at dusk, piled on carts, and taken to the burial pits behind the chapel. There, men in masks doused them in lime and covered them with sand. Some nights, the tide washed over the graves, uncovering what had been buried. The sea returned what it could not keep. And yet, even here, life persisted. Children played in the courtyards when the fever broke. Nurses sang hymns as they worked, their voices trembling but steady. Doctors took notes by candlelight, hoping that one day someone might understand the invisible terror that ruled their world. The lazarettos became Europe's first laboratories, crude, fearful, but driven by a need to understand. Venice began to document every ship, every death, every symptom. For the first time, the city tried to track disease, to give it a shape, a pattern, a logic. It was a fragile beginning, but it was the seed of modern epidemiology. As decades passed, new lazarettos were built. Lazaretto Nuovo for goods and cargo, San Clemente for nobility, Poveglia for the worst cases. An island so feared that even its name became a curse. Sailors whispered it like an oath, "May I not die on Poveglia." On Poveglia, the dead outnumbered the living. The burial pits there were so deep that, centuries later, when archaeologists began to dig, they found layer upon layer of bones, over 100,000 bodies burned, buried, and forgotten. The soil itself was said to be made of ash and bone dust. Locals still claim that nothing grows there that is not gray. But even among the horror, there were stories of hope. One tells of a nun named Sister Caterina who volunteered to serve on the island during the 1576 outbreak. She tended the sick with bare hands, believing her faith would shield her. When she too fell ill, she refused to leave. Her final words, according to witnesses, were, "If God made this island, then he also walks upon it." When the plague ended, they built a small shrine in her name. The sea has long since swallowed it, but her legend remains.
The Lazarettos changed Venice forever. The city learned that isolation was not just punishment, it was protection. That fear, when disciplined, could save lives. Every plague after that, in 1576, 1630, 1770, saw the same ritual. Ships waiting offshore, bells tolling, the sick ferried to the islands. The system was cruel, imperfect, but it worked. Venice survived. And so, paradoxically, the islands of death became symbols of survival. Merchants continued to trade. The city's wealth returned. Tourists came to marvel at its resilience.
never knowing that beyond the beauty of its canals lay a history written in disease and devotion. But the lazarettos never truly fell silent. Even after the plague faded, the islands remained, crumbling, empty, haunted by the memory of thousands who had breathed their last there. Fishermen claimed to hear voices when the wind blew from the east. Bells that no longer hung in the towers were said to toll at midnight. Visitors felt watched, as if the walls themselves remembered. Centuries later, when archaeologists uncovered the foundations of Lazaretto Vecchio, they found more than bones. They found rosaries, coins, letters sealed in wax, desperate messages that had never been delivered. One read, "To my wife, forgive me. Tell our children I wait for them by the sea." It had been buried beneath a stone step, as if the writer believed the tide itself would one day carry his words home. Today, the island is quiet again, overgrown with weeds. The old walls crumble into the lagoon, their bricks white with salt. Tourists pass by on boats, unaware that beneath the calm surface of the water lie the remains of thousands, men, women, children, who once prayed that the bells would ring for them again. And perhaps, in some way, they still do. On certain nights, when the mist hangs low and the moon glows pale over Venice, the faint toll of a bell drifts from across the lagoon. It is soft, almost kind, a sound not of fear, but of memory. The sound of an island that listened.
The sea, once a promise of freedom, had become a mirror of dread. By the late 14th century, fear itself was the new plague, invisible, contagious, unstoppable. It traveled from harbor to harbor, whispered by trembling lips, written in the eyes of sailors who had seen too much. The ships carried it more faithfully than any cargo. It needed no rat, no flea, no body, only belief. The waves that once glittered beneath the Venetian sun now seemed to murmur. Every creak of a mast, every gull's cry, every ripple in the tide became suspect. A shadow on the horizon could empty a city faster than a siege. Men who had braved storms and wars now trembled at the sight of a lone sail. The Mediterranean, once the bright heart of the world, was ruled by fear. It began with the stories. They spread from sailors' lips like sparks from a fire. In the taverns of Marseille, men swore that ghost ships followed them at night, ships crewed by skeletons, their lanterns glowing green. In Venice, dock workers claimed that the sound of oars in the fog was the voice of Death himself, rowing from city to city. Each tale twisted as it traveled, feeding on itself, growing darker, more real. A chronicler in Genoa wrote, "The plague has two faces, one of sickness, one of terror. The first kills the body, the second eats the soul." And that second face was everywhere. Sailors refused to board ships unless a priest blessed every plank. Fishermen burned their nets after each voyage. Mothers forbade their children from playing near the water. The sea that had raised them now frightened them. Its silence too deep, its beauty too clean. When a ship appeared offshore, people didn't cheer, they ran.
There was one ship that became the embodiment of this fear, the San Bartolomeo. In 1353, she sailed from Alexandria with a cargo of grain, bound for Naples. But when she appeared on the horizon 2 weeks later, the watchmen saw no movement on her decks. They waited a day, then 2, then 7. Finally, a group of soldiers rowed out. They boarded her at dusk. What they found was worse than death. Every man aboard had sealed himself in his cabin. Some had starved. Others had slit their wrists, leaving the walls streaked with dark, dried blood. The captain's log was still open, the last lines scrawled in a shaking hand. They cough in their sleep, though none yet have fever. The ship was towed away and set ablaze. But the story of the San Bartolomeo burned hotter than any fire. Soon every sailor in the Mediterranean claimed to have seen her ghostly twin, a ship with no crew, drifting silently toward the nearest port. Some swore she appeared before every new outbreak. Others believed she sought revenge, looking for the shore that had once refused her. Whether true or not, the fear became real. Ports closed at the mere sight of unknown sails. Quarantines multiplied. Trade slowed to a whisper. And in the space where commerce once flowed, paranoia thrived. The plague had taught Europe that death could travel unseen, but fear taught it something worse, that trust could be deadly. No one trusted sailors, no one trusted merchants, no one trusted the sea. Friend turned against friend, neighbor against neighbor. In some cities, sailors returning home were met not with embraces but with stones. In Ragusa, the guards at the gates refused entry even to nobles. One record from 1361 tells of a merchant galley denied harbor for over 3 months. When the captain finally died, his men buried him at sea, weeping into the wind. They were last seen drifting toward the horizon, their sails torn, their flag upside down, the ancient sign of surrender. Historians would later call it the Long Silence. For nearly 2 generations, the Mediterranean's busiest routes fell quiet. The water was there, blue and bright as ever, but the songs were gone.
And yet, the sea is patient. Over time, life began to stir again. Small fishing boats ventured out. Traders returned cautiously, their ships laden with prayers as much as cargo. They painted charms on their hulls, eyes, crosses, suns, anything to ward off the invisible. The Venetians began flying Sanita flags, bright yellow banners that proclaimed, "We are clean." But even these flags became symbols of fear. To see one meant danger was near, that death was still at sea. In one letter, a sailor from Genoa wrote to his wife, "I dream of the color yellow. I see it in the waves, in the sunrise, in my hands. When I close my eyes, I feel the sea turning to ash." It was not the disease that haunted him. It was the memory of it, the idea that it could return at any moment. That was the power of fear. It did not end when the plague did. It lingered, a ghost in every harbor. In time, this fear became law. Venice, Ragusa, and Marseille established permanent boards of health, councils of men who decided who could sail, who could dock, who could live. Their authority was absolute. A single rumor, a single whisper of sickness aboard a ship could sentence hundreds to isolation or death. The sea that once symbolized freedom was now a border, patrolled by invisible walls of suspicion. But even as fear tightened its grip, it began to evolve. From superstition, it gave birth to vigilance. From panic, it forged discipline. The fear that ruled the waves slowly became the science that would rule the world. For every ship burned in panic, another was studied. For every rumor of a curse, a doctor searched for a cause. The lazzarettos grew busier, not with the dying, but with scholars and physicians learning how contagion moved. The age of terror gave rise to the age of reason, though neither could ever fully defeat the other.
Still, not all stories ended in progress. Some remained as warnings, whispered across centuries. There was the tale of Il Vento Nero, the Black Wind, a ship said to appear during tempests. Her sails were torn, her masts cracked, and her deck littered with skeletons still bound by rope. Fishermen claimed she carried the souls of those who had died in quarantine, sailors who had begged to be let ashore and were denied. When she appeared, they said, a storm always followed, and with it, sickness. Even in the 1600s, Venetian sailors swore they saw her in the Adriatic. One captain wrote in his log, "I saw a ship without shadow, moving against the wind." The world was changing, maps expanding, science dawning, but the fear remained, immortal as the sea. Centuries later, the plague would fade, but its shadow would not. Every outbreak that followed, cholera, smallpox, yellow fever, carried echoes of those old terrors. Ports still closed, ships still burned, flags still flew in yellow. And in the hearts of those who lived by the water, a question lingered. If fear could spread faster than disease, was it not the greater plague? Perhaps it was, because fear changed everything it touched. It rewrote the laws of nations, reshaped the oceans into barriers, turned the sea, that ancient symbol of boundless freedom, into a place of exile and dread. And yet it also saved lives. It taught humankind caution, patience, respect for the unseen. It was both poison and cure, the dark twin of survival. Tonight, if you stand by the shore and listen closely, the waves still whisper those old lessons. They sound like sighs, like words half remembered. Beware, remember, wait. The same tide that carried the plague also carried wisdom. The same fear that ruled the waves gave birth to understanding. The sea endures. It forgives nothing. It forgets nothing. And as the tide rises and falls, it still tells the story of the centuries when Europe knelt before an invisible enemy, not the plague itself, but the terror it left behind.
Before the plague, the sea had been full of color. The white sails of merchants, the blue and gold banners of kingdoms, the bright silk pennants that fluttered proudly from masts. Each flag told a story of power, of pride, of trade. But by the 15th century, a new flag ruled the waves, a flag no one wanted to see. It was yellow, stained with red crosses. It did not proclaim a nation or a victory. It warned of death. The first of these banners appeared in Venice. The Senate decreed that any ship suspected of carrying disease must raise a yellow cloth with a crimson cross, visible from the shore. It was both a signal and a confession, a plea for mercy and a mark of exile. When the wind caught it, the flag snapped like a whip. To see it fluttering beyond the lagoon was to feel the heart stop in your chest. The Venetians called it Il segno della peste, the sign of the plague.
Soon, every port in Europe adopted its own version. In Marseille, they painted crosses on sails. In Dubrovnik, ships flew black banners marked with chalk. In London, the Red Cross of St. George became a mark of quarantine, daubed on doors, stitched into sails, burned into memory. And in time, that same symbol, the Red Cross on a white or yellow field, would become known across the world as both a warning and a prayer. The sea became a tapestry of fear. To the untrained eye, the harbor still looked alive, ships at anchor, masts swaying gently, gulls circling overhead. But look closer, and you would see that most of those vessels were ghosts, sealed by their own colors. No merchant dared approach them. No priest would bless them. They sat in the water, lonely and condemned, like penitents awaiting judgment. Each morning, the quarantine guards rowed between them, carrying food and water at the ends of long poles. They spoke little. Even their oars were marked with red paint, as if to warn the sea itself. When a sailor died, the body was wrapped in cloth and weighted with stones. Before sliding it into the water, the captain would kneel and whisper, "The cross watches." It was not a prayer, not really, more a resignation, a ritual that tried to make sense of the senseless.
The yellow flag, the quarantine flag, became one of the most feared sights in the world. At first, it was a symbol of isolation, but soon it grew into something larger, a code, a language of sickness. By the 1600s, its meaning had evolved. A single yellow flag meant caution. Two meant infection confirmed. A black flag meant death aboard. Even in distant colonies and new ports, the system spread. From Lisbon to London, from Algiers to Amsterdam, the same symbols fluttered in the same wind, a silent conversation across the sea. For travelers, the sight was heartbreaking. Ships that had once carried laughter now hung with these marks like shrouds. Entire fleets floated in quarantine, their flags bleached by sun and salt, their crews staring toward land they might never touch again. In Venice, where everything began, the quarantine officers kept meticulous records. They noted each flag, each name, each ship. Their ledgers read like an obituary of nations. The San Giovanni, yellow flag, 17 dead. The Fortuna, Red Cross, all crew deceased. The Madonna del Mar, quarantined, no survivors. The entries were made in red ink, and the pages smelled faintly of smoke. Those books still exist, their edges curled, their letters faded, the paper ghosts of an age when ink was as heavy as blood. But the flags were not only symbols of fear, they were also a strange form of order in chaos. They made the invisible visible. They gave death a color, a boundary, a rule. And that, in its own way, brought comfort. For the first time in history, disease was being managed not by prayer or punishment, but by protocol. It was a fragile kind of science, half belief, half observation, but it worked. Ports that obeyed the flag system survived more often than those that didn't. The colors of the plague became the first tools of public health.
Still, there was cruelty in the system. Many ships flew their yellow flags not because they were infected, but because they had come from infected ports. Entire crews were left to rot in quarantine, though none were sick. Letters from the time tell of sailors dying not of plague, but of hunger and despair. One, written by a French navigator in 1577, reads, "We have been under the yellow flag for 35 days. The water tastes of iron, and the wind is against us. At night, we see the lights of the city, but they will not take us. It is as if we have been erased." His handwriting trails off mid-sentence. The rest of the page is stained with salt. And yet, for all its cruelty, the system became the law of the sea. By the 17th century, every major harbor in Europe had quarantine regulations. The Red Cross flags flew not only over ships, but also over buildings, gates, and entire districts. When plague struck London again in 1665, the doors of infected homes were painted with the same mark, a large red cross, and beneath it the words, "Lord, have mercy upon us." The city itself became a fleet at anchor, each house its own vessel in quarantine. In Venice, the flag transformed once more. The Crimson Cross, once a symbol of sickness, became a mark of service. Doctors wore it on their robes. Priests embroidered it on their sleeves. Over time, it shed its curse and took on a new meaning: sacrifice, duty, compassion. From the ashes of the plague's terror, the symbol of the Red Cross, humanity's oldest emblem of mercy, was born. But the sea remembers differently. Even as medicine advanced and flags changed their meanings, the ghosts of the old quarantine banners lingered in memory. Sailors whispered that when a storm brewed suddenly on a calm day, it was the spirits of the flagged ships warning the living to stay away. Fishermen spoke of seeing torn yellow cloths tangled in their nets, relics of the plague years, carried by the currents. Superstitious captains refused to use red sails, fearing they might summon the same fate. One Venetian proverb survived long after the plague was gone: "When the cross flies, the sea dies." It was a reminder that color can carry memory, and that symbols, once born in terror, never truly fade. Today, when modern ships fly the yellow Q flag upon entering port, signaling "We are healthy" and request clearance, they are unknowingly echoing the same ritual that began 600 years ago. The flag has changed meaning, but not its power. It still speaks the language of caution, of distance, of respect for the unseen. And somewhere, beyond the reach of time, the ghosts of the old plague ships might still drift, their faded red crosses fluttering in winds that carry no name. Perhaps they watched the modern vessels glide safely into harbors, remembering when the sea belonged to silence. If the sea has memory, then every flag that flies today, from warships to cruise liners, is a descendant of those first desperate banners that once told the world, "Keep away, we are dying, but we are still here." Dawn rose over the Mediterranean, quiet and golden. The sea is smooth as glass. The port of Marseille shimmered like a jewel, its white limestone houses glowing in the morning light, its harbor alive with voices, bells, and sails. In the summer of 1720, Marseille was a city of triumph. It was France's gateway to the world, rich, proud, pulsing with trade from the Levant. Spices, silk, jewels, and gold poured into its docks. The merchants of Marseille believed themselves untouchable, blessed by fortune and faith alike. But far beyond the horizon, a single ship was making its way toward them. A ship that would end everything. Her name was Le Grand Saint-Antoine. She had sailed from the eastern Mediterranean, from Sidon, then Cyprus, then Smyrna, carrying a precious cargo of cotton, silk, and fine goods for the great annual fair of Beaucaire. Her captain, Jean-Baptiste Chateau, was a man of ambition and confidence, known in Marseille's mercantile circles for his daring voyages and impeccable timing. This trip, he believed, would make his fortune. But the sea had other plans. During the voyage, a strange sickness began to spread aboard. It started with a passenger, a Turkish merchant, who developed a high fever and swellings beneath his arms. He died within days.
Then a sailor fell ill, then another. The surgeon on board wrote in his log that it was a malignant fever of unknown cause. He ordered the bodies buried at sea, but by the time the Le Grand Saint-Antoine reached the coast of Sardinia, 9 men were dead. The Sardinian authorities, suspicious, refused entry. They ordered the ship away. So Captain Chateau turned toward the French coast, seeking the sanctuary of his home port. He believed that with the right connections, he could talk his way in, and he was right. When the ship anchored near Marseille in May 1720, quarantine inspectors rowed out to meet it. They questioned the crew, examined the cargo, and noted the deaths at sea. Their first judgment was clear. The ship must remain under quarantine for 40 days at the island station of Jar. But the merchants waiting for the cargo, wealthy men with influence at court, were impatient. The fair of Beaucaire was fast approaching, and every day lost meant fortunes slipping away. They used their power, their gold, and their persuasion. Within a week, the order was reversed. The Grand Saint-Antoine was allowed to unload. The decision was a death sentence. Within days, the dock workers who unloaded the bales of silk began to fall ill. The first to die was a porter named Roland, then his wife, then their neighbors. By June, the infection had reached the heart of the city. The symptoms were unmistakable: fever, black buboes, the stench of decay. Doctors tried to deny it. "It cannot be the plague," they said. "Not here, not in France." But denial is a fragile shield. By the end of the month, entire streets were empty. Marseille was dying. Fear turned to madness. Families locked themselves in their homes. Priests moved through the streets like phantoms, carrying crucifixes and incense. The dead were left where they fell, in doorways, on staircases, at fountains. Dogs fed on bodies. The air grew thick with the smell of rot. The city's great cathedral, once filled with music, echoed only with the sound of prayers whispered through masks. And still, the ships came. Trade could not stop. Greed has its own gravity. Merchants sent out smaller vessels to bring in goods from infected ships, hoping to salvage something. Each one brought back more death. By July, the plague had consumed the city. The hospitals overflowed, the priests collapsed, the bell ringers died at their ropes. The Archbishop of Arles wrote, "The living are not sufficient to bury the dead." The government in Paris, terrified the plague would spread inland, ordered the entire city sealed. Soldiers surrounded Marseille, forming a human wall. No one was allowed in or out. Inside, the survivors turned to desperate measures. They burned their homes, their clothes, their own dead. They believed fire could purify what God had forsaken. In the chaos, acts of heroism shone like stars through the smoke. One physician, Dr. Jean-Baptiste Bertrand, refused to flee. He moved from house to house, recording every symptom, every detail, determined to understand the enemy. His notes became one of the most precise medical documents of the 18th century. He wrote, "The city is an open tomb. The air carries cries and death alike. Yet even now, men cling to hope like shipwrecked sailors to driftwood." A ship's chaplain, Father Michel, buried hundreds with his own hands before succumbing to the plague himself. And a group of monks from the Abbey of St. Victor stayed behind to care for orphans, knowing full well
They would not live to see the next sunrise.
By August, Marseille had become a ghost city. From the sea, travelers saw only smoke, the skyline blurred by fire. The once crowded harbor was filled with silence and ash. Corpses floated in the shallows, drifting between abandoned ships. The Grand Saint-Antoine itself was seized, its hull emptied of cargo and sealed. Soldiers towed it to the island of Jarre, the very place it had first been ordered to stay. There, under the supervision of guards, it was burned to the waterline. Witnesses said the fire burned for 2 days and 2 nights, its smoke blacker than storm clouds. But it was too late. The disease had already leapt the walls, carried by refugees fleeing into Provence. Within weeks, it reached Arles, then Aix, then Avignon. By the time winter came, over 100,000 people were dead, nearly half the population of southern France. In the aftermath, Marseille was unrecognizable. The streets were lined with lime-soaked trenches. The bells of the churches were melted down to pay for burials. Survivors wandered like ghosts among the ruins of their own lives. The government sent inspectors, doctors, soldiers, but there was little left to save. They built new quarantine stations, reinforced the old ones, and passed strict maritime laws. No ship could enter a French port without a certificate of health. The word lazaretto became official policy, not just practice. And the Grand Saint-Antoine became legend, the ship that defied quarantine and doomed a city. Yet, even after the fires burned out and the plague receded, something deeper remained: guilt. The merchants who had lobbied for the ship's release were shunned. Some fled the country, others went mad. Captain Chateau, imprisoned for negligence, spent years trying to clear his name. He argued that he had only followed orders. He was eventually released, but he never sailed again. They said he lived the rest of his days by the sea, staring at the horizon as if waiting for forgiveness that never came. The people of Marseille remembered differently. For generations, they told stories of the cursed ship. They said that on certain nights, when the wind blew from the east, you could see her burning again on the horizon, a black silhouette against a crimson sky. Her mast creaked like a voice crying out, "Too late, too late." Even now, centuries later, the island of Jarre remains barren. Nothing grows there. Fishermen still avoid it, whispering prayers as they pass, because the sea, they say, remembers.
The tragedy of the Grand Saint-Antoine changed everything. It marked the end of an age of superstition and the beginning of modern disease control. It taught Europe that quarantine was not optional, that one man's greed could become a nation's grave. And it burned into the human mind the oldest lesson of the sea, that safety bought with denial is no safety at all. The yellow flag still flies today on modern ships entering port, not as a curse, but as a reminder. It says, "We are healthy, we seek permission to land." But behind those simple words lies the ghost of a ship that once begged for the same mercy and brought ruin instead. The sea has never forgotten the Grand Saint-Antoine, and perhaps it never will. The sea remembers the dead. It rolls over their bones, hums through their ribs, and whispers their names to no one. For centuries, sailors and priests alike believed that every soul lost to plague found its way to a single place, a silent island somewhere beyond sight, where the water was still and the air forever gray. They called it many names: l'Isola dei Morti, the silent shore, the island of the dead. No map marked its location, yet every country had one. In Venice, it was Poveglia. In Naples, San Granaro. In France, Jarre. Each was different, yet all were the same,
lonely patches of rock and grass where the living sent their dying and where the dying learned to wait.
It began, as always, with fear. When the plague returned in waves through the 15th and 16th centuries, cities once again turned to the sea for protection. But now they did something new. They gave the sea their dead. At first, they buried them in churchyards, but the graves filled quickly. So they ferried them across the water to the small islands beyond the harbors, and there they dug deep trenches and covered them with lime. The boats moved silently at dawn, loaded with bodies wrapped in cloth, the oars dipping without rhythm. A priest stood at the stern, whispering Latin prayers that even God might have grown weary of hearing. In Venice, the island of Poveglia became the largest of these burial grounds. By 1600, it had claimed so many souls that the ground itself changed color. The soil turned gray, rich with ash and bone dust. The fishermen said it was cursed, that even the worms would not eat the flesh of those who died there. They called it the island that breathes, because at night, when the wind was right, the earth itself seemed to sigh. Those who were sent there alive suffered most. They were the suspected, the ones who had shown fever but not yet death. They were loaded onto barges and left at the island's edge where plague doctors, in their beaked masks, stood waiting. The doctors did not touch them. They pointed with long sticks, directing the sick to their huts. There, among the moaning and the flies, they waited. Some recovered, most did not. From the city, the island looked peaceful, a dark smudge against the glittering lagoon. But up close, it was hell. The air was thick with the smell of rot and smoke. Fires burned day and night, consuming bodies faster than they could be buried. The sound of the pyres carried across the water, a low, endless roar, like the breathing of some monstrous beast. The living tried to sleep through it. The dead never stopped arriving. A monk who served there in 1576 wrote in his journal, "We are surrounded by silence that screams. Each morning the boats bring new faces. Each night we bury what is left. I fear that one day we will not notice when the living and the dead have changed places."
The plague islands became forbidden zones. No one went there willingly. When the epidemics ended, the cities tried to forget them. The bodies were left where they lay, the houses crumbled, the bells rusted in their towers. Grass grew over the graves, but memory does not die as easily as flesh. Sailors passing at night swore they saw lights moving among the ruins, torches carried by invisible hands. Fishermen heard laughter drifting across the lagoon, soft and hollow. One legend told of a doctor who had burned so many corpses that the smoke turned his lungs to stone. Another spoke of a child who had survived alone for years, playing among the bones, waiting for parents who never returned. Every city had its ghost stories. Every island, its silence. In Marseille, the island of Jarre was still blackened by the ashes of Le Grand Saint-Antoine. Years after the ship's burning, sailors refused to drop anchor nearby. They said the water shimmered strangely there, as if something beneath the surface still burned. On calm days, the sea around the island was warm to the touch. Fishermen crossed themselves and rowed faster. In Naples, the island of San Gennaro was turned into a cemetery so vast that its stones cracked under the weight of centuries. The priests who tended it wrote that the ground would move like breathing after heavy rain, the earth settling over the layers of the dead. In Venice, Poveglia endured the longest. It became a lazaretto again in the 1700s, a military outpost in the 1800s, an asylum in the 1900s. Each generation added new ghosts to the old. The plague had ended, but the fear never left. Patients claimed to hear voices in the walls, whispers in the water. One doctor who worked there in 1920 wrote, "The air is too full of memory. It presses on the skin like fever." If you visit Poveglia today, the island still stands, a ruin overrun by ivy and silence. The bell tower leans like a weary sentinel. The brick walls crumble into the sea. No ferries go there now, but divers who have braved the waters say the seabed around it is unlike any other. It is not sand or stone, it is bone. Centuries of it. Layer upon layer of skulls and ribs, polished smooth by the tide. When the sun hits the water just right, they glimmer white beneath the waves, as if the island is wearing a halo made of its own dead.
And yet, amid the horror, there was something sacred. For all their cruelty, these islands were places of mercy too. The dying were not left alone. Nurses, monks, and doctors chose to live among them, knowing the cost. Their names are mostly forgotten, but their actions endure in the quiet dignity of the graves they dug. The plague stripped humanity to its bones, but it also revealed its last strength, compassion. In Venice, a plaque still stands on the ruins of Lazaretto Vecchio. The inscription reads, "Here the living served the dying, and in doing so, they lived forever." Perhaps that is true, because though the plague ships have vanished, though their flags are gone and their fires are cold, these islands remain as their echoes, the last moorings of a civilization that once trembled before an unseen enemy and yet somehow survived. There are those who believe that the sea keeps what the land forgets. If so, then the island of the dead is not just one place, but many, scattered across the world, joined by the same tide. From the French coast to the Venetian lagoon, from the shores of Malta to the ports of Alexandria, the bones of the plague's victims lie together in a vast, invisible cemetery, bound by water. Every wave that breaks upon the shore carries a fragment of them, a memory, a whisper, a prayer. And maybe that is fitting, because the sea that took so much life also gave us memory. It taught us to fear, yes, but also to remember, to mourn, and to endure. Tonight, as the wind moves across the water, the islands are quiet. No bells, no fires, no voices, only the endless sound of the sea breathing, patient and eternal. Somewhere beneath the waves, 1,000 souls sleep, and the tide rocks them gently, like a mother soothing her children. The island of the dead is not gone. It simply waits, a monument carved from silence and salt, forever watching the horizon. The plague ships may have burned, the bells may have fallen silent, but one kind of light never went out, the flicker of a candle burning in a locked room. Behind the walls of monasteries, within the vaults of universities, and deep beneath the quarantine islands, men and women began to ask a question that terrified their own souls. What is death? And more dangerously, can it be understood? It was the 15th century, an age torn between faith and reason. The plague had come and gone in waves, leaving millions dead and millions more obsessed with its mystery. The priests said it was God's will. The alchemists said it was imbalance, corrupted air, poisoned blood. But the new thinkers, the physicians of the humanist age, whispered another idea. Perhaps death had rules. Perhaps the invisible had order. If that were true, then it could be studied. In the Venetian lazzarettos, where the sick were isolated by the thousands, the first experiments began. Doctors, weary from failure, started to open the bodies of the dead. They called it divine dissection, an act of knowledge for the sake of salvation. At night, by torchlight, they cut into the blackened flesh of plague victims, searching for the source of the corruption. The stench was unbearable. Even through waxed masks and herbal cloths, it clung to their lungs, their skin, their souls. But they persisted. A surgeon named Giovanni de Rossi, whose journal survives in fragments, wrote, "In the chest I find dark fluid that bubbles like tar. The heart is shriveled, the lungs heavy as stone. I do not know if this is the seat of the pestilence or of fear itself." Another, Dr. Tommaso Alves, believed the disease could be trapped and destroyed. He collected air from plague rooms in glass vessels, sealing them with wax. Then he buried them in ash for 40 days, waiting to see if the miasma would die. When he opened the jars, he described smelling the breath of hell. He never finished his notes.
As the centuries turned, the experiments grew stranger. In 1508, the French physician Jean de Villeneuve conducted dissections aboard quarantine ships themselves, floating laboratories of death. He wrote that he could hear the sea through the planks as he worked, the slow rhythm of waves mingling with the rasp of his saw. To him, it was like listening to God breathe. He injected vinegar into the veins of corpses, believing it could cleanse the body from within. He placed rats beside human remains, observing how quickly they died. When he found that the animals sickened faster near the lungs, he declared that the plague was not a curse, but a vapor born of breath. No one believed him, but he was right. Others sought cures in stranger places. Alchemists claimed that if death had a formula, then life must as well. They mixed mercury, sulfur, and wine, testing their brews on the dying. Some concoctions brought momentary relief, others killed faster. In Prague, a monk named Brother Laurent tried to distill the essence of purity from rose petals. He called it aqua vitae, the water of life. He gave it to plague victims by the spoonful. Every one of them died, but he recorded that their eyes looked peaceful. Perhaps that was enough for him. In London, the plague returned in 1665, and with it came a new breed of experimenter, part scientist, part priest, part lunatic. The Royal College of Physicians recorded men sealing themselves in pest houses to test theories of contagion. One doctor inhaled the fumes of infected bedding to know the enemy firsthand. He died within the week, but his notes survived. The pestilence has taste. It is sweet, like metal and honey. Another coated his skin in pitch and oil, convinced it would block the poison. He survived, and the rumor spread that oil was protection. Within days, the streets filled with men shining like candles, slick with false hope.
In Venice, the Lazaretto Vecchio became a laboratory as much as a prison. Doctors began collecting samples, blood, bile, and pus, sealing them in bottles labeled with Latin prayers. They sent their findings to universities in Padua and Bologna, where scholars studied them by candlelight,
trying to read the handwriting of death. One specimen, a glass jar containing dark fluid from the lung of a sailor, still survives in the archives of Padua. Inside, the liquid has turned black, the seal still unbroken after 400 years. For those who worked among the dying, knowledge became a kind of madness. They began to believe that by understanding death, they could control it. One Venetian doctor wrote to his colleague, "I fear the sickness no longer. It listens when I speak." Soon after, he vanished. His notes end mid-sentence. But the most infamous of all plague experimenters was Dr. Paolo Ferrante, a physician who served in the 1630 outbreak. Ferrante believed that fear itself caused the plague. The terror weakened the body's vital flame. To prove his theory, he conducted experiments so cruel that his name was struck from the records for centuries. He brought condemned prisoners to the Lazaretto Nuovo. Some he kept in darkness, surrounded by the moans of the dying. Others he placed in sunlight and gave wine and music. Those who lived longest, he wrote, were the ones who forgot what they feared. When the authorities discovered his work, Ferrante was exiled. He died years later in a monastery, still convinced he had found the key to life. To heal the body, one must quiet the soul. The Church condemned such practices, but it too was fascinated by the plague's mysteries. Monks in Florence experimented with holy water infused with crushed emeralds. Nuns in Avignon brewed potions from relic dust and myrrh, which they called saint's breath. When these failed, they turned to fasting and flagellation, believing that pain could drive out pestilence. And yet, behind closed doors, even the devout kept journals, curious to see whether faith or medicine would win. They didn't realize that both were reaching towards the same truth, that fear and faith were two sides of the same coin, and both were tools to survive the unknowable.
By the dawn of the Enlightenment, the plague had faded, but its shadow remained in the laboratories of Europe. Dissection became study, infection became theory. The whispers of the lazarettos evolved into the science of contagion, the birth of microbiology. Men like Fracastoro and Leeuwenhoek would build upon the madness of their predecessors, turning horror into understanding. The invisible world they sought was real, just smaller than they had ever imagined. But something was lost, too. The early plague doctors, for all their fear, had approached death with reverence. They believed it spoke in symbols, in smoke, in wind, in color. When science took over, death became a thing to be measured, not mourned. The candles that once burned for prayer now burned for progress. Yet sometimes, late at night, even the new doctors felt the old fear return. They would pause over their instruments, their scalpels glinting in the light, and remember the stories of the plague ships, the islands, the bells, the red crosses. They would look into the black fluid of the lungs and wonder if perhaps the darkness was not just disease, but memory. The memory of the sea, the memory of every hand that had reached for understanding and found only silence. Because no matter how much they learned, death never gave up all its secrets. The invisible remained invisible, and the experiment, the great experiment of humanity against mortality, was far from over. The sea had carried death across the world, but in its wake, something new began to take shape, the birth of the modern age. When the plague ships vanished and the fires in the harbors dimmed, the world that emerged was not the same one that had burned. The plague had torn the map of civilization apart, and then, in strange, terrible ways, had redrawn it. It began with silence, After the great waves of the Black Death, entire regions of Europe lay empty. Villages were abandoned, fields overgrown, cities half deserted. The churchyards overflowed. The roads were quiet. The living wandered through the ruins of the old world, dazed, asking what sins could have earned such punishment. But as the morning faded, something unexpected happened. The survivors began to rebuild. And in rebuilding, they changed everything. Before the plague, the world had been bound by old hierarchies, kings, priests, merchants, and peasants, each locked in their place. But the plague killed without asking who was noble or poor, holy or sinful. The great equalizer had no crown, no creed. And when it was over, the balance of power had shifted. Laborers were scarce now, and the fields would not plow themselves. In England, the surviving peasants began to demand wages instead of obedience. In France and Italy, farmers who once belonged to the land found that the land now belonged to them, for there were no lords left to claim it. The feudal system, centuries old, began to crack like old wood under the weight of a new world. In Florence, the chronicler Matteo Villani wrote, "Those who remain alive demand double for their work, and none can refuse them." A sentence that signaled not just recovery, but revolution. The Black Death had killed half of Europe, but it also freed the rest.
The empires of trade changed too. The plague had taught merchants that the sea could kill as easily as it enriched. The ports of Venice, Genoa, and Ragusa had survived by inventing new rules, quarantines, health boards, and sanitation systems. Those same tools, born of fear, became the foundations of empire. The Venetian Republic, once paralyzed by plague, rose stronger from its ashes. It built entire bureaucracies devoted to health. Inspectors, guards, physicians of the sea. Each ship was catalogued, each sailor recorded. Venice turned fear into policy, and policy into power. From its ports spread not just goods, but ideas, that disease could be controlled, that danger could be measured, that information was as valuable as gold. This new mastery of the unseen became the invisible machinery behind Europe's rise. And so, in a grim irony, the same plague that had silenced the seas helped create the systems that would make global empires possible. But not every empire survived. The Mongol Khanates that once stretched from China to the Black Sea began to crumble after the plague. Trade along the Silk Road slowed to a trickle. The ancient connection between East and West, the very artery that had carried silk and spices, and yes, the plague itself, began to close. In its place rose new powers, new routes, new ambitions. The Ottomans seized what the Mongols had lost. In the chaos left by the plague, they built order. Their cities, from Constantinople to Cairo, became centers of trade reborn. They studied the Venetian quarantines, improved them, and spread them across their empire. From plague control came border control. From fear came empire. The disease that once united the world in suffering now divided it into masters and subjects.
Even across the seas, the ripples spread. Centuries later, when European explorers ventured into new lands, they carried with them not only weapons and flags, but the ancient lessons of the plague. Quarantine, inspection, control, these became tools of conquest. Colonial ports in India, Africa, and the Americas all bore the same marks: quarantine islands at their entrances, lazarettos on their shores.
The Red Cross flags that once flew over the plague ships now flew over colonial hospitals. Empire had learned that to rule, one must master not only men, but microbes. In 1799, when Napoleon's troops invaded Egypt, they brought physicians who studied the plague as carefully as they mapped the pyramids. When cholera swept through India in the 1800s, British officials resurrected Venetian methods to protect their ports. The ghosts of the medieval doctors walked beside the colonial officers, invisible but everywhere. But the changes were not only political, they were spiritual. The plague had taught humanity something that no sermon could, that life was fragile, that the earth was unpredictable, and that salvation might not come from heaven, but from human hands. In art, the old ideals of perfection gave way to realism. Painters began to show suffering, decay, mortality. In science, the obsession with the unseen became a lifelong pursuit, the search for what could not be seen, but must exist. In faith, people began to question, why had God allowed such horror? Why had the good died with the wicked? And in that questioning, a new kind of faith was born, one that looked not to priests, but to knowledge. The Renaissance was not born of peace. It was born of plague.
Venice became the first city to turn health into government. Its quarantine islands became models for the world's first public hospitals. Its inspectors' ledgers, dusty, obsessive, filled with names of the dead, became the earliest censuses, and its rules, written in fear, became the grammar of the modern state. Isolation, documentation, prevention, control. In a sense, the plague built the modern world out of ashes. It broke the old gods, dethroned the old kings, and crowned the bureaucrats, the doctors, the thinkers. It replaced divine mystery with human inquiry, and in doing so, it reshaped the destiny of nations. But every gain had its price. As the centuries passed, the memory of the plague faded, yet its architecture remained. The invisible scaffolding beneath modern power. The same systems that once protected cities from disease would later be used to control people in other ways, to confine, to surveil, to divide. The lines between protection and domination blurred like ink on wet parchment. It was the plague that taught empires how to watch. Every port inspection, every health passport, every checkpoint, these were echoes of the lazarettos. Fear of infection became fear of outsiders, of strangers, of the different. The disease was gone, but its paranoia endured. Even now, in airports and borders across the world, when thermal scanners hum and faces are studied for signs of fever, we are living inside the shadow of the plague. The old fear still rules, dressed in modern clothing.
And yet, for all the terror, there was something strangely redemptive about what the plague left behind. It forced humanity to look inward, to study itself, to build systems of care, to question power, to innovate. It pushed the world from mysticism to medicine, from isolation to interdependence. The same sea that once carried the plague now carried knowledge, science, and trade across continents. The same ships that once brought death now bore progress. Empires rose on the bones of the dead. Venice, Spain, Britain, France. Each of them learned the lessons of the plague, turned them into law, into expansion, into power, and in doing so became heirs to both its horror and its wisdom. The world grew smaller, but its fear grew larger. Tonight, if you stand on the shores of the Venetian lagoon, or in the harbors of Marseille, or beside the quiet Thames, you can still feel that legacy in the air. The bells no longer ring for the dead,
but the water still glimmers with memory. The breeze that carries salt also carries the faint echo of a time when a single ship could change the fate of nations. The plague destroyed half the world, and from the ashes, humanity built the other half anew. Every empire that came after bore its fingerprints. Every city that rose from ruin carried its shadow, because the plague did not just kill, it rewrote civilization. By the dawn of the 1800s, Europe had convinced itself that it was safe. The plague was a story now, something buried beneath the marble of history, something taught to children as a lesson in fear and faith. The lazarettos were empty, the quarantine flags folded away, and the harbors once more rang with laughter and the clang of trade. The world had turned its back on the Black Death. But the sea, as always, remembers. In 1817, from the humid deltas of the Ganges River, a new sickness began to move. It had no sores, no blackened skin, no familiar warning. It came instead as thirst, an unquenchable, burning thirst. Men would feel their stomachs twist, their limbs cramp, their skin turn blue like bruised marble. Within hours, they were dead, their bodies shriveled as if the life had been drained straight from the blood. It was not the plague. It was cholera.
At first, the West did not fear it. It was, they said, an Asiatic disease, a problem for the colonies. But as trade expanded, so did the tide. By 1829, the sickness had reached Moscow. By 1831, it stood at the gates of London. And once again, the ships brought it. In the summer of 1832, a vessel named the Apollo arrived from Hamburg, flying a yellow quarantine flag. She had lost 6 men at sea, all within 3 days of the same strange symptoms: vomiting, cramps, collapse. The London authorities hesitated. The merchants pressed for her release. After all, the goods she carried, textiles and sugar, were urgently needed. The captain swore the illness was not contagious. He said, "It comes from the water, not from man." They believed him. The ship was allowed to dock. Within weeks, the city was drowning in death. Over 6,000 Londoners perished that summer, many within hours of showing signs. The streets reeked of lime and vomit. The water pumps ran red. People whispered that it was the wrath of God. Others said it came from the mists rising off the Thames. But those who worked the docks knew the truth. It had come on a ship. From that moment, cholera traveled the trade routes like a phantom. The disease did not creep, it raced. Unlike the slow incubation of plague, cholera struck and killed within a day. Ships became floating death traps, vessels that left one continent alive and arrived on another full of corpses. In 1832, the Caroline arrived in Quebec after crossing the Atlantic. By the time she reached harbor, half her passengers were dead. The survivors, pale and trembling, were forced into tents along the shore, guarded by soldiers. They begged for water, but no one dared approach. A witness wrote, "They looked like ghosts who had forgotten how to die." The port doctors burned the ship. The smoke rose high above the river, black and bitter, visible for miles. But the sickness had already escaped, carried on the breath, the clothes, the water barrels. Soon, cholera was marching down the St. Lawrence, then across the Atlantic again, reaching France, Italy, and beyond. The plague had returned, wearing a new face.
The lazarettos opened again. In Marseille, men tore down the weeds from the old quarantine islands and rebuilt the guardhouses. In Venice, yellow flags flew once more. But something had changed. This time, the people did not believe in divine punishment. They believed in corruption, in bad air, in filth. Doctors blamed the poor, the immigrants, the foreign ships. Fear once again became law. Ships entering port were detained for weeks, sometimes months. Sailors were stripped, bathed in vinegar, and confined in iron cages on the docks. Cargo was fumigated, clothes boiled, letters baked in ovens to kill the invisible contagion. The smell of burning paper filled the harbors. Letters between lovers, families, merchants, reduced to ash in the name of safety. One Venetian official wrote, "The smoke from the ovens rises like incense. We sacrifice our words to save our flesh." But cholera did not obey quarantine. It traveled faster than any ship could be stopped. It rode the rivers inland, the canals, the wells. It hid in the water itself. In Hamburg, officials tried to close the ports, but the city starved. In London, merchants defied quarantine to keep the docks alive. Once again, greed and denial waged war against fear, and fear won. The cholera years brought panic, the likes of which even the plague had not inspired. The sickness was silent, invisible, and without cure. It did not care for class or faith. And this time, people didn't even have the comfort of superstition. They had science, and science in those years had no answers. Doctors cut open bodies by the thousands. They dissected victims on ships, in hospitals, in the streets. They found only emptiness, shriveled organs, drained veins. Some said the soul itself had fled. Others swore they could smell the disease, that it tasted of iron and salt. And yet no one could find its source.
One man came close. In 1854, a London physician named John Snow suspected that cholera spread not through air, but through water. He traced an outbreak in Soho to a single contaminated pump on Broad Street. When the handle was removed, the deaths stopped. But few believed him. The old fear of bad air ran too deep. Still, Snow's discovery would change the world. It was the first time anyone had proven that disease could travel through what people could not see. Not miasma, not divine punishment, but something microscopic. The age of modern epidemiology was born in the shadow of the cholera ships. Meanwhile, the seas continued to tell their own story. In the Indian Ocean, British steamers carried troops and cholera alike. In the Red Sea, pilgrims returning from Mecca were struck down by the hundreds, their bodies tossed into the waves. In the Atlantic, ships from New Orleans to Liverpool flew the yellow flag, begging for permission to land. The disease knew no border, no flag, no faith. In Naples, 1884, the cholera returned with fury. The people blamed the government for poisoning their wells. Riots erupted. Soldiers fired on crowds. The dead piled in the streets as ships in the harbor raised their warning colors, red crosses on yellow fields, and waited for orders that never came. In that moment, the world realized the truth. Humanity had built its empires on water, and water was now its enemy.
Cholera, more than any war, taught the modern world humility. It forced nations to build sewers, aqueducts, and hospitals. It birthed sanitation systems, public health acts, and international treaties. But it also revealed something darker, that when fear spreads faster than knowledge, cruelty always follows. Immigrants arriving in America were herded into detention centers on islands like Ellis and Hoffman, new lazarettos for a new age. They were stripped, examined, deloused, and sometimes deported without ever stepping on the mainland. The language of quarantine, once born in the ports of Venice,
had become the law of nations. The ghosts of the plague ships now haunted the modern world in bureaucracy, paperwork, and passports. By the century's end, the cholera ships were everywhere. In every harbor, flags of warning fluttered, yellow for caution, black for death. The sound of coughing carried across the decks. Sailors sang to drown it out, songs of home they would never see again. And yet, the world kept sailing, because it had to. Trade, progress, empire, all demanded motion. The sea had killed millions, but it had also made nations. No one could stop sailing, even if death rode with them. So the ships kept moving, the flags kept flying, and the waves whispered the same old story, that no empire, no science, no wall can keep the sea from remembering. The cholera ships marked the end of an illusion, the belief that humanity could conquer nature. They reminded the world that the sea is older than civilization and less forgiving than time. And though the flags have changed and the diseases have new names, the story remains the same. A ship leaves one shore full of hope. It arrives at another full of ghosts. The plague taught us to fear death. Cholera taught us to fear ourselves.
Long after the fires of the lazarettos went cold, long after the quarantine flags were folded away, the sea still whispered. It whispered names, forgotten captains, lost ports, and ships that should not have been able to sail. The plague was gone, but its shadow had learned to live forever, not in the body, but in the story. And on moonlit nights, those stories came back to life. The sailors of the Mediterranean used to say that the sea could remember every death it had ever seen, that every scream, every prayer, every final breath sank into the depths and stayed there, echoing. Sometimes, when the air was still and the water flat as glass, those echoes rose again, and when they did, the living mistook them for ghosts. The most famous of these tales began in the late 1600s, told and retold in every port from Lisbon to Alexandria. The legend of La Nave Bianca, the White Ship. It was said to appear only on nights of perfect calm, when the sea was like a mirror and the moonlight silvered every wave. From a distance it looked beautiful, a white galley with tall masts and shimmering sails. But as it drew near, the sailors who saw it realized the truth. The ship was not white from paint or wood, it was white from bones. They said the hull was made of human ribs, its sails of stretched skin, its lanterns glowing with the fire of dead souls. And on its deck walked the shades of plague victims, their faces hidden behind the long-beaked masks of forgotten doctors. They rowed in silence, their oars dripping not with water, but with blood-dark tears. No one who hailed the ship ever received an answer. But if you ignored it, if you turned your back on its ghostly passage, you would hear a sound behind you, a slow knocking, like a hand on wood. 3 knocks, always 3. The sailors said it meant death would come for you before the next new moon.
There were other tales, too. In the Baltic, fishermen spoke of the Ship of Bells, a spectral vessel whose rigging jingled faintly in the fog. They said it carried the souls of those who had died at sea but were never buried, sailors whose bodies had drifted too long and become unclaimed. Each bell, they believed, rang for a name that the sea had forgotten. And on some nights, when storms rolled across the horizon, those bells could be heard even from the shore, faint, sorrowful, like the echo of prayers said too late. In England, the legend took a different form.
They called it the Black Brig, said to haunt the Thames after the burning of the Ghost Fleet. Its captain was a skeleton in a tattered naval coat, his hand still gripping the wheel. Londoners swore they saw it during the colliery years, a dark shadow gliding upriver, its flag a red cross on black cloth. No one dared look too long. It was said that to see the Black Brig's lanterns was to invite the sickness back into your house. Historians dismissed these stories, of course, but stories are stubborn things. They survive where facts drown. And for sailors who had lived through the plague, the myths felt truer than any law or scripture. They had seen ships full of corpses drifting in silence. They had heard the cries of the dying carried on the tide. When they told tales of ghostly vessels, they weren't inventing, they were remembering. A Venetian captain once said, "Every sailor carries two maps, one of the sea and one of the dead." Perhaps he was right, because even in the age of science, the sea refused to give up its ghosts.
In the 18th and 19th centuries, as cholera replaced the plague and the world began to move by steam instead of sail, the old legends simply changed shape. The ghost ships became ironclads. Their sails became smokestacks, but the stories stayed the same. In 1853, off the coast of Malta, a British steamer reported seeing a derelict drifting toward it, a three-masted ship, its decks crawling with what looked like sailors. But when the crew shouted a greeting, there was no reply. Through their telescopes, they saw that the figures weren't moving. They were standing perfectly still, facing the sea, their arms outstretched. When a boarding party rowed over, they found the truth. The men were dead, their skin pale and glassy from salt, their eyes open. The ship's log had ended 2 months earlier. In its final line, the captain had written, "The water tastes like rot. God help us." The British ship towed the vessel toward port and lost half its crew to fever within a week. The newspapers called it the floating tomb of the Mediterranean. The sailors called it something else, La Nave Bianca reborn. As decades passed, the legends grew richer, stitched together with the threads of fear, faith, and memory. In some stories, the ghost ships were harbingers of plague, omens of sickness returning. In others, they were guardians, ferrymen who kept the dead from coming back. Every culture made its own peace with the sea's cruelty. In Greece, they spoke of the silent sailor, a lone figure who appeared in the fog before outbreaks, steering a black boat toward shore.
In Sicily, they told of the Lady in the Red Veil, a spirit said to visit ports to warn of infection, her veil soaked in the blood of the first to die. In Marseille, they said that when lightning struck over the harbor, the shapes of the plague ships appeared in the clouds, as if heaven itself remembered their outlines. These were not just ghost stories. They were medicine for the soul, the only way to explain why death kept returning to the water's edge. In a world that had learned too late that science could not stop fear, myth became the language of grief. Even today, the legends persist. Fishermen in the Adriatic still whisper about phantom lights that follow their boats at night. Divers claim to have heard bells ringing beneath the waves. And in Venice, on still evenings when the fog rolls thick across the lagoon, some say they can see shapes gliding just below the surface, long and narrow, like ships made of shadow. The old men of the docks nod knowingly and say, "They're not gone, they never leave." Because in the end, the plague ships were never just wood and sail. They were the embodiment of something deeper, humanity's eternal struggle with the unseen. They carried not only disease, but guilt, memory, fear, and the fragile hope of survival. And such things do not die easily. There's a story told in Venice to this day. They say that once every 100 years, when the moon is full and the tide is high, the gates of the lagoon open wide, and all the ships that ever died return. The water glows silver, and out of it rise 1,000 ghostly hulls, the Saint Lucia, the Grand Saint Antoine, the White Ship, the Black Brig. Their lanterns burn blue, their sails ripple without wind, and for one night the dead sail beside the living once more. Some claim it's a curse, others say it's a warning, a reminder that the sea keeps its own calendar, and that every ship, no matter how proud, eventually joins the fleet of silence. But most who tell the story simply end it with a whisper. Listen when the waves are still. You'll hear them.
Because the myths, like the sea, never rest. They rise and fall with the tides, returning when the world grows too confident, too forgetful, too sure that it has conquered fear. And when that happens, when the wind carries a strange whisper across the water, when the fog moves against the current, and when you think you see something glimmering far out on the horizon, don't look too long. It might just be a trick of the light, or it might be the sea remembering. The plague ships are gone, but their ghosts still sail. The sea is calm now. The waves that once carried death lap softly against the shores of Europe. The Red Cross flags are gone, the lazarettos are ruins, and the ghost ships have faded into legend. Yet their legacy lingers, not in wood or bone, but in the invisible architecture of the modern world. The plague ships did not just bring death, they brought order out of chaos, science out of superstition, and memory out of fear. They were the crucible in which humanity was tested and changed forever. Once the sea had been freedom, but when the first plague ship drifted into Messina, it became something else, a border. For the first time, the world realized that danger could travel faster than armies, that enemies could be invisible, that safety could depend not on walls or swords, but on discipline, patience, and knowledge. The Black Death ended feudalism. The plague ships began globalization. In Venice, the system of quarantines created an empire of observation. Every ship had to report where it had sailed, what ports it had touched, who it had lost. The fede di sanità, the certificate of health, became as important as any passport. That simple piece of parchment, stamped and signed, was the ancestor of every modern border document, every vaccination record, every customs form. A world of commerce had invented, out of fear, the bureaucracy of survival. From those records grew medicine as we know it, data, pattern, diagnosis. The physicians of the lazarettos, who once worked by instinct and candlelight, became the forefathers of epidemiology. Their notes, their failures, their dissections, all born of desperation, became the foundations of a science that would one day name its invisible enemy, the bacterium. When Louis Pasteur and Robert Koch isolated the causes of cholera and plague centuries later, they were completing the story that began on the plague ships. The invisible had finally been given a face.
But the plague's other legacy was fear, not just of death, but of difference. The same logic that saved cities also taught them to close their gates, to mark certain people as unsafe. Foreigners, travelers, migrants, those who came from infected lands. The quarantine line became a social one.
And from that invisible border would grow the institutions of exclusion that still shadow our world. Even now, when the word quarantine is spoken, it carries both meanings: safety and separation, mercy and suspicion. It is the echo of the same question that haunted every harbor master since 1347. Who is clean enough to come ashore? The plague ships also reshaped faith. For centuries, people had prayed for deliverance from divine wrath, but the plague taught them that salvation required action, not only prayer. Doctors replaced priests as the interpreters of death. The mask replaced the rosary. The laboratory replaced the chapel. In that transformation lay the birth of the modern spirit, a faith not in heaven, but in human reason. And yet, even reason could not banish awe. The plague doctors may have become scientists, but they never stopped being priests in their own way, standing between the living and the dead, whispering to both. The world that the plague ships left behind was paradoxical, cleaner, wiser, but also colder. Fear of contagion taught people to wash, to disinfect, to organize, but also to isolate, to distrust, to control. Empires learned to govern through the language of disease. Healthy became another word for obedient. Dangerous became synonymous with foreign. What began as a system to protect the living slowly became a system to manage them. The echoes of that system are everywhere. In passports, in medical screenings, in quarantine laws that still hold the power to close borders and silence movement. Every time a plane is grounded for health inspection, every time a traveler fills out a declaration of origin, the ghosts of the plague ships are present, quietly steering from beneath the surface of time.
But legacy is never only shadow. From the same fear rose compassion. The plague taught humanity the value of care, not as charity, but as survival. Nurses, physicians, and volunteers who stayed among the dying became heroes, symbols of the human capacity to love even when love was fatal. Hospitals grew from that courage. Public health was born not from comfort, but from sacrifice. The nurses who walked through cholera wards, the doctors who risked infection to study the invisible, the sailors who flew yellow flags rather than spread death, all of them inherited the spirit of those who once stood on plague docks and refused to run. Every hospital light that burns through the night today is a descendant of those candles that once flickered in the wind over Lazaretto Vecchio. And then there is memory, because the sea, like time, forgets nothing. Across Europe, bones still lie beneath the waves. Sailors, prisoners, lovers, children. Their names are lost, but their lessons remain. They taught us that fear can destroy, but it can also teach. That isolation can be cruelty, but also protection. That humanity's greatest strength is not in its walls or weapons, but in its ability to learn from pain. In Venice, when the tide is low, you can still walk along the edge of the old quarantine islands. The stones are slick with moss, the air heavy with salt. If you listen closely, you can hear the whisper of water inside the walls, as though the island itself is breathing. It is the breath of centuries, the sound of the past refusing to die. The legacy of the plague ships is not in their death tolls or their ruins, but in the way they forced humankind to see itself. They taught us that survival is not guaranteed, that progress is fragile, and that the sea, that ancient mirror, reflects not only our beauty, but our arrogance. Every age has its own plague, its own ships,
its own fear, but the lesson remains the same. The sea will always bring us back to ourselves. When the next great sickness comes, and it always does, we will raise our new flags, light our new candles, and remember, even if we do not admit it, what the old world already knew, that safety comes at a price, that compassion is the only cure, and that the ghosts of the plague ships still wait, patient as the tide.
If you ever stand by the harbor at night, when the wind falls still and the water glows faintly under the moon, you may hear them. Faint bells, distant voices, the creak of timbers that no longer exist. It is not the sea you're hearing. It is history, reminding you that it is never gone. The ships are gone, but their wake stretches into eternity. Every ripple in the water carries their story. Every light at sea, every flag that flutters, every whisper of wind over the waves, all of it belongs to them. The plague ships that terrified Europe are still sailing, not in the water, but in us, and they always will.